Thank you for joining us for the conference and for this panel on promoting diversity and inclusion in public service pedagogy. My name is José Luis Irizarry, and I am a conference co-chair this year, the moderator for this panel, and an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Springfield. Very quickly, I'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Blue, then go to Lorenda, Michelle, and Paul, while I pin you guys to the top.
Okay, I'm not quite sure.
Just say who you are and your affiliation.
Okay, I'm Blue Wooldridge. I've been around social equity leadership conference since the fourth one back in 2002 or 4, something like that. And I'm now a retired professor. I'm a has-been. I'm a retired professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, a Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. Thank you.
Fantastic. Michelle, would you like to go next?
Sure. Michelle Evans. I'm an assistant professor at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and I get to do lovely research with José Irizarry.
Lorenda, would you like to go next? Okay, while she figures it out, Paul, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Paul Terry, pronouns he, they. I occupy Putwin lands, work at UC Davis overseeing our diversity programming across all of our alumni. And I'm also a doctoral student in international multicultural education, focused in human rights and racial justice education at USF.
Awesome. Laura, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, I am Lori Naylor. I'm with the University of Baltimore in the College of Public Affairs, and delighted to be here today to join you all on this very, very important panel. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us, especially to the panelists. Without you, we wouldn't have a panel. To the attendees in the room, please feel free to enter comments and questions in the chat. I will try to incorporate them at the end. We'll hold questions for the end. We're going to start the presentations now in the order of the program. So Blue, you are first.
Well, let's see if I can share this.
You can share this.
Ooh. I'm trying to. I knew I was going to run into problems. Oh, wait a minute. Which slideshow? That's what I'm supposed to do. Since I'm not being a professor this semester, I've forgotten all of what little skills I had on using PowerPoint. Well, anyway, this is a topic that I've been interested in, oddly enough, since about 1976, when, or at least part of my research goes back to 1976, when I was doing a training program at the International City Management Conference in Toronto. And it led me into one theme, but of course, the pandemic has increased the importance of looking at online education. Here's some information about me, more than you need. I am delighted to say I just received the Gloria Hobson Social Equity Award from ASPA at their conference, at our conference back in March. And if you, I have my email address at the very end of this. So it's bwooldry at VCU edu at the very end of this, and I will be delighted if the PowerPoints aren't being shared. We'll be delighted to share this and get your comments on it later on. And this was written, the actual manuscript was written, I'll introduce this, why we started doing this, about 3 years ago by one of my brilliant MPA students at the Wilder School, and she and I did the original research on a topic, oddly enough, called attributes of successful online students. It took me a year or two to talk about inequities. I love this comment. It was written, it was first presented at the Minnowbrook One conference in 1968 at Syracuse University. Dwight Waldo, George Fredrickson, and 35 young Turks all got together to critique administration. And Todd, who out your way someplace, I think he's at the School of Public Policy at Berkeley, but he came out with this definition or proclamation about what is the premise of public administration. And that is the purpose of public organizations should be the reduction of economic, social, and psychic suffering and the enhancement of life opportunities for those within and outside of the organization. And I use this now as the beginning of a lot of presentations dealing with social equity. There's many definitions of social equity, and I'm sure you've run into many of them already yesterday and today. I usually start off my presentations with about a half a dozen, including the famous one put out by the National Academy of Public Administration. But I really like this one. I was introduced to this a definition and this institute, and I encourage you to take a look at it. You can Google it and so on. It's at the Institute of State and Local Government at the City University of New York. And I was introduced to it at the 2018 Social Equity Leadership Conference, which was held at Baruch. Equity. Everyone has the same, and I inserted high level of economic, education, health, housing, justice, and service outcomes. And I like this because it focuses on outcomes, regardless of race, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, gender, single parenthood, age, immigration status, place of residence, and other characteristics. The Conference of Minority Public Administration, COMPA, which I was president back in the 60s, had us, after COVID-19 hit us, had a series of webinars, excellent webinars. And in the first one of the speakers from Morehouse said, COVID-19, and this was like in 2020, COVID-19 is not the great equalizer because it hasn't impacted us all equally, but it is the great revealer. And again, this is a beautiful way to delve into the impact of inequities caused by or exacerbated by COVID-19. And in this case, in higher education. And one of the great books that I encourage you to read, introduced to me again by our good friend, belated George Fredrickson at a social equity conference. There were two books, one called The Spirit Level, that was published in about 2009. And then this one was published in 2019 called The Inner Level by Wilkinson and Pickett. Again, you can Google it, but these are two British epidemiologists that have gathered research on what is the impact of inequities. Now, going into online instruction, and I start off with some basic definitions of online instruction and online learning and hybrid classes. Of course, they were around before the pandemic hit us 2 years ago, but of course, and also they accelerated since that time. Here's just some statistics. And as I said, I've got some more of that. If anyone's interested, they can contact me. Before online became the in thing, I used to, when I was still on campus in Richmond, I used to gather a group of instructional administrative faculty across VCU to identify the attributes of successful online students. The main purpose of our monthly meetings was to have lunch every month, to catch up, drink wine at one of our favorite restaurants. But we did focus on this topic enough that, as I said, I got Jessica to research with me, and there was a good research even back in 98 or no, 2008 or something like that. The point is not everybody succeeds equally well from online education. As I said, during our meetings, our discussions were mainly focused around what are the attributes of successful online students. And we did a review of institutional websites, previous research, our own impressions. I was doing some work with two colleagues in our Masters of Information Systems program in our business school to try to do some research on who succeeded, who was successful on online students, and what are some of the attributes. Our review of the literature suggested that there were these 6 characteristics of online students. Technical abilities. Did they have experience online? Access issues, which is a big issue, and which hopefully the federal government with their the Biden plan is spending billions of dollars to improve access. Environmental and lifestyle factors related to student success. Internal factors, congruent cognitive learning styles. There are some people that suggest, and this is what I latched on to back in 1977, that there's different cognitive styles, and I hypothesize there are certain cognitive styles that are more congruent to being successful in online education than others. And also minority status. The review of the literature suggests that Black and Brown and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and low income, people from low income backgrounds are in general less successful on online education. And this is why it becomes the social equity issue. Here is just some of the literature that I reviewed. And I want to go, again, you can read this in more detail. And we have a lot more, and I have a copy of Jessica's and my review of the literature. And I might add, Dr. Naylor and I have done some research in the past and getting ready to do some research in the future. In talking about access issues, we have a state council on higher education in Virginia, and they published some studies back in 2020, a closer look at Virginia digital divide. Statewide, 1 in 5 students at K through 12 and college level either lack a high-speed internet or physical computer. 20% of rural Virginia students lack broadband at home, which is being addressed by the Biden bill. It's not only rural, though. Of the 265,000 Virginia students without high internet access, about 100,000 of them live in or near cities. And I might add, I had faculty colleagues who lived in a computer desert. And of course, State Council on Higher Education found race and income-based disparities. Black and Latino students were twice more likely than their white peers to not have a laptop, desktop, or notebook. 16% of low-income students households were within internet, and 19%, and these of course approximate estimates, lack devices. So this is.
I hate to interrupt.
Yeah.
We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Now, let me, self-motivation is very, very important. I want to get into congruent learning styles, and I particularly want you to become alert, identify what are learning styles and different cognitive styles. I spend a lot of time looking at field dependent, field independent. People are either analytically compatible or relational compatible. And my feeling is that people who are relational compatible are not as successful on online instruction. And there's a lot more in terms of this, and I had some other readings. This is some research I did in a 2000 level psych class showing the distribution. People that are 9 or 10 on the group embedded figure test are more likely to be successful on online instruction. I summarized the characteristics of these students, but in summary, Jessica and I included that many PA programs are implementing online instruction for many reasons, increasing enrollments, etc., without serious inquiry into its implications for diversity and inclusion. Certainly, online instruction will promote diversity and inclusion of some dimensions. Access for students who, because of geographical location or work-family balance, cannot attend traditional face-to-face classes. However, there appears to me there's little doubt that higher education will increasingly rely on online instruction to deliver material to our students. However, to answer our good friend George Fredrickson's second question as to is the policy effective and who is it effective for will require more sensitive concern for social equity, high quality research, and my email address is right here. Thank you very much, Jose.
Thank you so much, Blue. You're making my job a lot harder because it's so much to, exert the power I have over someone like yourself. I've met Blue when I first started my MPA.
Like an old man, yes, but no, you did it very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on the program is Lorenda Naylor.
Thank you. And thank you, Blue, for laying a strong foundation for our discussion here today. Greatly appreciate it. I'm going to start by, and Jose, did you get my PowerPoint slides? Okay,
yes.
excellent.
Would you like me to upload them or you got it?
That would be great if you would. Yeah.
I got it here. Hold on.
So what I'm going to do is actually start with context and background of where we are at in terms of higher education as we sit here today in 2022. So if you go about the third or fourth slide on higher ed context, Jose. There we go, back there. So what we know in terms of the most recent data in terms of college enrollment is that between fall of 2020 and 2021, student enrollment decreased by almost 1 million in the country, which is a significant drop. And that decrease was uneven. On one hand, we saw public institutions, those who really, their mission was to enroll students of color, students who were low income, students who are first generation, they saw more significant drops than compared to the top tiered universities and second tiered universities who actually saw increases. So the most selective institutions saw greater increases in applications. So the other thing that we know that's important here is race and income. They both matter. 97% of high income students graduate in 6 years. That's phenomenal. It's miraculous. Compared to only 23% of low income students. And this is due just not to lack of financial assistance, but they also have, they are perhaps working 2 jobs. They have caregiving demands, all those types of things that take away from their studies. The next issue is race. 60% of white students graduate in 4 years compared to 49% of Hispanics and 40% of Black students. And what we know is that most students are graduating in 6 years. 4 years is no longer the norm or what is typical. Next slide, please.
Oh, lost it. There we go.
And building on what my dear colleague, Dr. Wooldridge was saying, online classes are very popular. 50% of all college classes are now offered online. And our concern, and Blue had talked about this, is that online classes have a higher dropout rate than in person when you do a side-by-side comparison. Now, what we do know, and this is interesting, is that the hybrid courses, in other words, classes that offer both face-to-face, a mixture, if you will, as well as online, that difference in dropout rate, it disappears. There is no difference between those two. So when you compare those modalities, that dropout rate disappears. Next slide, please. For fall 2021, this is recent data, survey data, and I think it's really important. It came out through Sallie Mae. 33% of students surveyed. Now, keep in mind, this is after being at home a year and in an online environment. 33% of students surveyed preferred hybrid classes. 36%, only 3% higher, preferred in-person, and 12% preferred online only. So what we know from this is we can predict more than likely is that universities will continue to offer more hybrid classes. In other words, a blend of both worlds. The other thing that I think is really, really important is when they interview and survey students, 71% of Black students and 54% of Hispanic. So students of color believe online education can open doors for minority students that aren't there in a face-to-face environment. 52% of Blacks and 54% of Hispanic students believe it can speed up graduation. And 44% Black and 46% Hispanic believe that the online classes give them the opportunity to complete their degrees that they simply just don't have in a strictly face-to-face environment. Next slide shows a visual graphic of this. If you want to take a look at it, you can compare the data across Black, Hispanic, and white students. So there's a nice visual for you. And I can also send you the slides if you like to, just let me know. Next slide, please. So what we know is that our public institutions, our HBCUs, are predominantly Black institutions and Hispanic as well as Indian colleges, is that the demand for online education is there. We can predict it's going to continue because we need to maximize flexibility for students who may be working one or two different jobs, as well as have caregiving responsibilities. And that could be caregiving for parents. It could be for children or relatives, but they really, really need the flexibility in order to complete their degree successfully. Next slide. And Blue mentioned this. I just want to just highlight it really quickly. The 4 core factors for online education. I just spoke about income and race and how we need to be sensitive to that. There's also online technical barriers, the cognitive learning styles, and I consider Blue the expert on cognitive learning styles. And then also student sense of connection. All of those are really important variables that we should focus on, in addition to the ones that Blue had mentioned. Next slide, please. So in terms of online tech barriers, the other thing I think is important in addition to the ones that were previously mentioned is home environments. Sometimes students don't have a home environment that is conducive to learning, right? There may be background noise. They may be sharing devices. It might be disrupting. There's a whole other things that we need to take into consideration as we plan for online education. Next slide, please. Cognitive learning styles. This is pulled directly from Blue and I share research, and we do research together. So I call them global learners, and Blue calls them relationship in terms of builders, and the other one is analytical. But there is a short list of variables and characteristics for those 2 types of learners, and just how incredibly important it is that we know what type of learners we have in our classrooms. Next slide. So one thing I want to focus on is student sense of connection. And a lot of this research began with Shin, but we need to focus on students' sense of connection with other students in the class, in other words, their peers, as well as faculty members and university administration. And I think since the pandemic had occurred, there is a greater emphasis, and we need to add, we had, 3 different, a tiered prong approach, and we also need to add student resources. Those matter. It can be library services. It can be the writing lab, tutorial labs, as well as mental health services. All those items, those components that universities offer are really, really important to students and their sense of connection and their level of support that they receive. And I think what we can do with online classes, you can have discussion forums, there's chat, video conferencing, team assignments, all ways we can engage students to work with each other and get to know each other and to create and expand their social network, professional network as well. Next slide, please. So what we know, and specifically with our public administration students who are often working full-time jobs, is they need flexibility in their course modalities as well as schedules. We know that those who are self-motivated, highly disciplined, they're more likely to be successful in our online courses. Now, the work that Blue and I did, and also work we did with another colleague of ours, Laura Wilson, what we found in our research is that neither gender or race plays a significant or statistically significant role in student perceptions of connection in terms of online courses. That doesn't play a role. The relationship to the university does, as well as faculty. But one of the things they're really focused on, it has to be quality in terms of those interactions, as well as frequency, that we need both of them. And I think what is interesting is that when you look at earlier research, for example, back in 2005, what that research showed was that Black students prefer traditional in-person classes compared to white students. And now what we're seeing with that earlier research that I just showed you from 2021 is that minority students now prefer online courses because it gives them greater access and an opportunity to finish their degrees. Next slide, please.
Laurie, we have about a minute left.
Okay, great. So in terms of next steps, I think it's really important that as universities, we match our missions and designing courses, not only in terms of modalities, but courses themselves to meet the needs of our students. And we need to create online courses with both types of learners in order to increase graduation rates. The work that Blue and I are getting ready to start is going to assess both of these: student cognitive learning styles, as well as perceptions of connection. I am convinced, not only based on the evidence of research, that those two variables can provide a greater prediction of student success as well as student graduation if we pay attention to those and incorporate those two components in course modalities as well as in our individual courses. And with that, I will close. Thank you very much for your time. And I will put my email in the chat room. If anybody would like to contact me, I can send out PowerPoint slides. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. Our next presenter is Michelle D. Evans.
Hello. Let me try, and I've got screen sharing, I'm assuming. Okay, you better try. So let's see, my name is Michelle Evans, and I'm going to present a working project right now that I'm doing in conjunction with Dr. Irizarry here. So I'm going to skip kind of some of the normal conference presentation, build through all the different steps, because this is a really short time, and then José can jump in if I've missed something incredibly important. Now, the research we're going to present, or that I'm presenting on behalf of, is a project that we've been doing in several stages. And the first couple of stages have already been published or in R&R. And then we are working on our third stage, where we're starting to look at inclusive pedagogy as communicated in course syllabi, and look at elements, and I'm sorry, my computer's just changing screens for no reasons. Look at elements such as course policies, course assignments, things like that, for evidence of inclusive practices that help create this environment, either directly through the efforts or by creating this environment of getting students and participants more involved in the discussions, and thereby increasing the inclusivity in the classroom. And then kind of based upon the way life has been going the last couple of years, and definitely based upon my personal experience in the state of Tennessee, we decided to add an extra element to the paper in this third stage and start comparing some of these inclusive practices that we're identifying and looking at them in conjunction with legislative efforts in different states. and trying to determine what would or would not work within different frameworks. So as I said, it's totally a working project right now. So we definitely would love to get some feedback from you all as we go through. And I'm going to try and jump ahead a little bit to try and stay within the time dynamics. Overall, normally, inclusive pedagogy, we'd be talking about a number of different elements. I've got kind of 4 of the key ones up there where you're looking at representation, how things are communicated, the language that is used. But for the items we're going to look at today, we're going to look at more of these course environments and the assignments and activities that may go, that may be communicated through those syllabi. And when we're talking about inclusive pedagogy is built on the foundations of a lot of different frameworks. The ones that we use most common in our work is based upon feminist pedagogy, the professionalization, the socialization norms that come through and are connected oftentimes with accreditation, professional ethics, and then very definitely the evolving and emerging social equity efforts, hence we're at this conference. So our original sample is nonprofit syllabi. So we're looking at nonprofit graduate education and then starting to look at these legislative efforts. And we're still in the process. We're just starting to code the legislative stuff. So we're just going to highlight one state, which I'm going to take the prerogative of grabbing the state that I work in, because I'm going to pull in, using the feminist pedagogy type stuff, I'm going to pull in some personal experience. But if we look at the legislative efforts, and I apologize, my computer for some reason keeps advancing the PowerPoint slide, even though I swear I'm not touching anything. So in the state of Tennessee, you may or may not have heard if you followed the news, there have been 2 very definite legislative efforts over the last year, and one that is in the proposed state. And I pulled some excerpts from them here. And even though our syllabi right now are looking mainly at graduate education, we decided we'd go ahead and, at least at this stage, look at all the legislative efforts, whether they're geared towards higher education or K-12, because the efforts for K-12 may be a precursor to what they may do for higher ed, or it at least is talking about the broader state environment leading into higher education. So that if something is being taught or not being taught in K-12, it still is going to impact that higher education because the students may or may not be familiar with concepts, or they may be used to a certain environment. But even here in the state of Tennessee, the Tennessee 493 that was geared towards K-12, limiting what sorts of topics could be addressed in classrooms. And as you can see, that schools can't promote subjects like racism, sexism, oppression, or anything that might cause discomfort. And as you know, if you're sitting in a social equity leadership conference, pretty much everything we teach in public administration in connection to social equity is going to trigger on those types of concepts. And even though that was K-12, that was passed the year before a very similar law was passed for higher education. So that's why we wanted to look at some of this precursor stuff. So just this year in Tennessee, we've had a similar bill that has been passed that is focused on, and I'm using the quotes intentionally because this is the language from the legislation, divisive concepts. So they have a very long, detailed description of what counts as a divisive concept. But pretty much you can count anything considered racism, sexism, oppression, systemic oppression, or anything that might cause discomfort is considered a divisive concept. And they even specifically target the phrase race or sex scapegoating within the legislation as well. Now, at least with the higher ed, as I got noted on the screen, there is a section of the bill that does specify that there is academic freedom, which I'll get to on the next slide. And I did want to highlight that we pulled up, at least for now, proposed legislations, not been passed yet, but we wanted to look at it in terms of, again, something that may be a precursor, a sign of what's coming, or at the very least, it helps give you a sense of what the climate, that even a proposed bill may create a climate. And so in the state of Tennessee, they have a proposed bill very similar to the state of Florida, where in Tennessee, they're proposing that for K-12, you cannot, for instance, utilize a textbook or any instructional material that in any way promotes, normalizes, or supports LGBT issues or lifestyles. So keep that in mind, because I'll come back to that one in a second. Now, as I said, there is on the higher education, which obviously impacts me teaching at UTC, there is a protection for academic freedom in writing, that I should have these protections. Doesn't change the fact that I may not be concerned, doesn't change that somebody may not have read the entire bill, but I do have the protection of academic freedom that specifically gives me the freedom of speech, gives me the specific academic freedom is specified, and it particularly highlights that anything that is perhaps required by accreditation or anything required under a state or a federal law, I would be protected to teach that. So that does give comfort in terms of some of the public administration subjects. So now switching gears to the inclusive pedagogy. This is the coding that we've already gone through several rounds of coding in the syllabi to start identifying items that would be considered inclusive pedagogy, falling within some of those four broad themes that I talked about. Things that would show representation, because inclusive pedagogy specifically calls for the inclusion, no pun intended, of visibility of demographics, gender, race, ethnicity, but also of what they call sensitive topics that may be something connected to this or maybe a lens that you could use. So that's a specific request that they want you to put in. In terms of syllabi, other ways that you can kind of get some of these influences by looking at which policies may be listed in the syllabus. And so we were finding many syllabi that were starting to have not just the normal ADA or academic integrity policies, those type things, but we're having specific harassment policies mentioned and anti-discrimination, some that were listed as social justice. Oh my, a social justice policy. That sounds like it might remind me of a divisive concept. I say somewhat with sarcasm at this point. But other things that may be influenced or seen in the syllabi are notifications or links to resources connected to different populations, such as LGBTQ resources, Title IX resources, indication of safe zones. For instance, at UTC, I'm certified in safe zone so that students can come and feel free to talk to me about certain topics. Or even things like family-friendly policies, it would indicate an inclusive environment. And then we were starting to look specifically at those assignments, activities that are utilizing those sensitive topics or utilizing other inclusive pedagogies, such as creating assignments that are requesting students to use their lived or personal experience as part of the assignment, so that as we have more and more diversity in our classroom, assignments and discussions that utilize that personal experience, thereby bring in more diversity in the classroom. I'm only one person. I bring in one type of intersectional diversity in a classroom, but by having more of the students' intersectional diversity, it can create more of an inclusive environment. So we started looking at those types of things. And I apologize, I know they're really text-heavy slides. Normally I hate text-heavy slides, but this is how it works this time around. So when we're starting to look at some of these syllabi and looking at some of these examples of what they have in the syllabus that we would log and code as inclusive practices, such as those self-reflection and lived experience assignments. And you can see how the professor has phrased it quite eloquently. I love this. River of life carried you to a profession, or how you are planning on working with people in communities. The way they have styled that description not only gets that student to bring that personal experience into the classroom and gets them to see how they can personalize the course material through their life, and so creates a wonderful inclusive element in the classroom. I don't see anything in the way they have that phrase that would in any way run afoul as written of those laws. But what if a student just creates a write-up that talks about their personal experience, participating in a Black Lives Matter rally over a summer or something like that? That may be something that may at least trigger interest within the classroom. But the way it's communicated in the syllabus would not seem to run afoul of any of those legislative attempts. But if you look at some of the ones lower on the slide, where one class was having students specifically go and do an online activity where, and they had this specified in the syllabus, they go to part of the activity that says, choose the skin tone, light skin or dark skin. Again, that would seem to perhaps be something that may be triggering as a divisive concept. And the students must, they're told that they may skip the demographic information in the exercise, but the exercise forces them to go beyond that point. So they have to encounter the material. Now, we coded that as very much of an inclusive activity that is bringing in those sensitive topics, allowing students to personalize that assignment, but it may or may not be triggering under different legislation.
Michelle, we have about 30 seconds to a minute left.
Okay, cool, thank you. Wow, time goes quickly. And so I'll give a very particular one. The reason I highlighted that LGBTQ in the high school stuff is the very top one on this slide is my personal assignment that I do in many, many classes, where I use the early AIDS crisis to illustrate the nonprofit sector. I make them watch a documentary in the process. Now, I have academic freedoms according to the Tennessee law, but if they have now created a climate in high schools of, anything that brings discomfort or prohibitions on anything that promotes this, then not only am I going to be perhaps inhibited, so far I haven't been, but certainly my students are not going to be prepared for that inclusive activity. So even though I'm doing something that falls within that concept, those laws are creating an environment perhaps that makes that inclusive classroom very difficult. So I'll go ahead and stop it there, other than to say that we would love any sort of comments or feedbacks on you as we try and envision how we're going to take these two massive things and put them together in one big project. Anything I missed there, Jose?
Very much appreciate it. No, and we don't have time to go over it. So please follow up with us after the session, and we will, as Michelle said, really greatly appreciate your feedback and insight. Our next presenter is Paul David Terry, and it looks like he's ready. Thank you, Paul. You're muted, by the way.
Hopefully I'm not muted now.
You're good.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone. I just want to start off that if I'm moving around a lot, I usually do tree pose during I'm at a standing desk during my lectures, but I hope you take a chance to do some sort of touch pedagogy or motion, because that's usually how things stick. I want to start off with a little bit about my work. So my research looks at systematic deconstruction of bias and advancing humanizing research through connected learning. So often we get bucketed training. So we might do the anti-racism training, the gender bias training, or the queer people training. But I look at how this is interconnected. For example, how gender bias came upon these lands through the erasure of indigenous people who had up to 5 genders, matriarchies and women, leading tribes, and viewed queer people as protectors. And without these conversations, or without these connectivities, conversations on race or gender may further marginalize indigenous people in discussions and the intersections of both. And so as I was thinking about what this presentation would be about, I really reflected on the workshops that I was doing over the last year. And through about 20 different presentations I gave, it looked at the spectrum. Was someone not muted? Who is?
I'm sorry,
someone-
I'm trying to locate them. Everyone,
Okay.
please mute. Thank you.
Nah, I got it. I got it.
Thank you.
Anyways, the nonprofit sector is a vast spectrum, from healthcare to higher education to social justice to education. And so of the presentations that I gave over the last year, I'm kind of bucketing them into here to think about how we can integrate storytelling as a way to advance learners. This is how we have things stick. And while not every organization here might not be listed as a 501c3, there's a lot of volunteerism involved. So for example, if you're on a task force, you are usually voluntold to do it, and oftentimes said, take the anti-bias training and you'll be bias-free and be able to advocate across identities. But that's not always the case, probably. And so this was really an audit ethnography reflecting on all these presentations to think about how I've integrated storytelling and ways in these different areas we can do it. Now, when I think about identifying, deconstructing bias and advancing equity, I'm taking it from Paulo Freire or Melanie Tervalon and Jean-Marie Garcia's work on cultural humility, that in order for us to advance equity, we need to know what bias looks like, not based upon stereotypes, but what we're doing now. And that critical awareness is really important. And one of the best ways we can do that is through storytelling. So just some basics about storytelling. Stories are how we gain data. They're through so many methodologies. So here we have the hero's journey, which is a really great way that's through children's books to our daily lives. And this is a way that we can think about transformational growth. It's how we build cultural competency, change attitudes, and gain knowledge and insight. It's how we develop our skills around populations and augment our awareness, but it also has a capability of being outdated, reliant on biased selections of population health. And, you think about survey research, everyone's burned out. So are we actually collecting the right population data for research for that? Outdated information can lead to stereotypes and potentially causing microaggressions and trauma associated with prejudice. One thing we can counter this is with counter storytelling, which is grounded in the experiences and knowledge of people of color. It's a way that we can gain truth telling and remembering of what is authentically happening over the dominant narrative. It's a way we can freedom dream as a community and think of something advanced. And it's also an area of thinking about how performativity, play, and even drag is practiced for strategic defiance. Each of us are on Zoom and not our authentic self. We are all performing drag on Zoom. We are all performing. You even get to choose not to be here or put your photo on or do whatever, but that is not the truth that we're here. And that is not, and you're actually saying something different than what is in real life. And that is such a powerful thing to think about. I also think about the canon. So in education and organizational leadership, we present John Dewey's work on being this transformational educational pillar, and yet we leave out the information on how it harmed Indigenous populations, attempting to erase them and eradicate them. How often do you hear that story along with his work? So what I did is really thinking about these different areas. So in the nonprofit sector, in healthcare, it's thinking about clinicians who have to take in patient data and are reliant on understanding populations across the board. Think about racial healing circles. I mentioned task force and how we collect stories, particularly through online mechanisms. Looking at for example, the tribal justice system, when tribal justice lawyers and judges are making healthcare decisions without a health background, or being a pivotal moment for our BIPOC and queer BIPOC students in our academic world. We also think about how we design our bias systems. So in the nonprofit world, with maybe the lacking of training, we're building those gender bias, those queer bias, those racial bias systems, because we just don't have the lack of training, the lack of funding. And then last thing, it's the educational design. I mean, I'm teaching a lot of I'm teaching critical race theory to a lot of teachers around this country who are like, I'm being told I'm teaching critical race theory and being bullied, and I don't even know what that is. And so thinking about how we can use stories around the margin to really teach both teachers and parents and a lot of educators on what that means. So going through these 4 areas, I'm going to list some ways we can think about integrating storytelling. So things like social justice storytelling and oral history of patient intake. It's really thinking about the responsibility and the person on the other side and really listening through oral history rather than seeing a patient as just data. It's also building that trust through online communities that you're building the system both online and in person, that if people are going to submit their story, you need to figure out how to avoid re-traumatization and really get that authentic data. In the academic world, it's thinking about how, for example, social justice and health education, and those pillars can be integrated into law when people are making decisions around tribal justice. Thinking about the power of identity when you're in different communities and being able to advocate across identities. It's a lifelong work and it's very difficult. But if we're really going to truly do this, it's also showing representation of stories of the people, of your students, particularly queer and BIPOC people, in the education and being able to represent that in the teaching that you do. It's also thinking about when we do, let's say, action research or qualitative research, who and how are stories collected and how are you in relation to communities? For social justice, we see a lot of, as I mentioned, CRMs, donor relations, systems, and culture are built around pillars of bias because it's just not integrated. We just saw recently that APA just introduced gender neutral terms in research, but if you look at the research back before it, we know that it's biased and we're still using that as part of the canon. Thinking about volunteer management, public scholarship, and social movements, and how employee resource groups are often tasked to lead across all identities, but provided little training. And so if you start bringing in storytelling in this, you start connecting across communities. And then how to talk about race and race theory for leaders. Again, we've talked about the discomfort. This is always going to be discomfort, but we need to do this. And some of the best ways are really through stories. Doing stories around land acknowledgements that go beyond just reading a set of text, to talking about Indigenous people, talking about Black people, talking about what has happened with whiteness as property. And last, it's thinking about how we can reframe education. So for example, I've taught for UC Davis anthropology, a class on the evolution of sex. So after the students actually learn about gender, sex, the history, and the evolution, I come in and say, okay, now that you know what bias and all of these things are and the truth telling, the history, you can finally go into, let's say, healthcare or any organization and actually advance equity because you know what's going on, you know the history. It's like coming to this idea where often we come in and we're like, oh, hey, I'm going to use these pronouns and be so proud of it. It's like, well, welcome to healthcare 10 years ago when they integrated into health systems, or welcome to queer communities 30 years ago when they've been using it, or welcome to Indigenous communities thousands of years ago that when they already saw this ahead of time. So where are you on that spectrum for deconstructing bias, and how behind are you? Last couple of things is thinking about decolonizing curriculum. So for example, I'm working with community college district in STEM, and everything is based upon old white dudes. And they really want to figure out how do we inspire and be pivotal moments for our queer, our BIPOC students, our students with abilities. Well, let's talk about the canon itself. So for example, Mendel, who talks about peas and genetics. Why can't we talk about corn in Indigenous communities? I mean, have you seen what corn looked like 4,000 years ago? It was this little teeny thing. Let's talk about the agriculture and put that against the canon. And lastly, when we talk about critical race theory and applying it and what it is, like this is something that's going on everywhere. But instead of talking about critical race theory, you know, I work with students and parents, and we have students who come home and the parents are like, my kid is calling me racist. What do I do? And it's like, well, how much time have you spent on critical awareness around racism, around sexism, around genderism, and in that discomfort? Children are thriving in this. You are not. So how can you turn to, instead of leading with ignorance, is to really sit with this and sit with yourself and your own story to be able to inspire for the next thing. And that's what I have for you today. And I'm going to drop the resources, information, and contact information in there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I was keeping a watch for time because we only have about 4 minutes left, but I didn't want to interrupt you because I find it fascinating and selfishly very relevant to the research that I do. So I apologize to everyone for my biases, but we do have time for a quick question or two. So if you have a question, please turn on your cam and tell us, or put it in the chat. I will give you guys a second to do that. We can start with a question that was put in the chat directed at Michelle a little while ago. She responded, but I don't know if there's more to it. The question was from Regina Winters. Will your project also take note of how enforcement is completed for the Tennessee legislation? Will there be an active review of curriculum, or will violations or concerns be levied through existing grievance policies? Thank you. The project is very interesting. Michelle, would you like to respond verbally for the recording?
Sure, I had put in the chat that yes, that is actually one of the things that we do have down to code. What we're finding is that coding on some of this stuff is more challenging than we thought, because as you all probably guessed, the laws are perhaps less clear than anticipated. So in some places, it's been challenging to identify that, but that is something we want to look at, because you know, that the enforcement mechanism is really relevant, or even just the whether something is allowed, not allowed, whether there's an enforcement mechanism or not, is not going to stop, say, a student from wanting to complain that something's going on. And so even if there isn't a formal enforcement mechanism that they may choose, they may slam you in your course evals, which may then have that, you know, longer impact on promotion and tenure type stuff. Not that I'm selfishly thinking about that as somebody who's getting ready to hopefully go up for tenure soon, and I teach these subjects and I do this research. But yes, it's definitely something that's really important to look at.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We just got an alert that we are going to be kicked out in now less than 2 minutes. Let's say about 90 seconds or so. So in the interest of time, then I'm going to just turn it over to the panelists for a 20 to 22 second final response, starting with Paul, then we'll go with Lori and Blue.
Yeah, I just think that, you know, what I wanted to show today is that this is a systemic thing, and you could draw in lessons from any subject, but that is the power of disrupting white supremacy in academia, is breaking down those silos.
Thank you so much. Lori, who, by the way, congratulations to Dr. Lorenda Naylor, made full professor at the University of Baltimore. Oh, you're muted. Lori, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much. I think the key takeaway from my presentation is keep your eyes on online education and hybrid as a way that we can help low-income students and students of color. We need to increase those graduation rates, and I think that's one of the avenues in which to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Blue?
Wonderful panel. I learned a great deal, and I think that it behooves us all to pay attention to potential inequities, whatever we're doing and we're talking about higher education and so on. So there's a lot of